Hi, how are you? I'm Mr. Muso. Today we want to talk about European history. We want to talk about the French Revolution. We want to talk about the first revolutionary government that came to power in 1789 up to 1791, the so-called the National Assembly. So we want to talk about this question. Make sure your pen and also your notebook is close to you. So here is our question. To what extent did the 1791 Constitution satisfy the demands of the revolutionaries in France? I'll take that question again. To what extent did the 1791 Constitution satisfy the demands of the revolutionaries in France? So let's start by underlining the key words on our question. The key words on our question is to what extent. Then 1791 Constitution, then satisfy, then demands, then revolutionaries in France. So we are talking about the 1791 Constitution. Remember, when the parties were formed, the next thing that was done was to vote. People were told to prepare to go for an election. Why for an election? It was because the mandate of the National Assembly, it was to design a constitution. After designing a constitution, they were now supposed to elect. They were supposed now to have a new government that was supposed to rule in accordance to the constitution, in accordance to what they had deliberated on the National Assembly. So we are saying that that constitution that was formulated, that was ended in 1791, did it satisfy the demands of the revolutionaries in France? Is it what the people wanted when they came up, when they formulated this so-called the constitution? So what can we say about this question? Now let's talk about this question in detail. So on the other side, we are going to talk about the 1791 constitution. Then on the other side, we'll talk about the failures of the 1791 constitution, that it not satisfy, it not meet what the people expected, it not discuss or review what the people expected to be done. So let's start with the first side of the question. We see that in the 1791 Constitution, people were now allowed to vote. On the August crisis, people, they were allowed to vote. People were now going to participate in an election. Previously, I think you know that people voted as states, not as individuals. But now here, people could now vote as individuals. That was a milestone. That was an achievement. So the 1791 Constitution, it satisfied the demands of the French revolutionaries in the sense that people were now in a position of partaking in an election. That on its own, it was an achievement. You move on, you also talk about liberalism. People were now free to express themselves. People were now free to say their thoughts or their minds. That on its own now, it was an achievement. Before the revolution broke out, people who said anything against Louis, they were arrested. People who criticized the government of Louis, they were arrested. But now, people were free to express their thoughts. People were free to say their minds. They were free to criticize the government. That is what the people wanted. They wanted liberalism. And when they revolted in 1791, they wanted liberalism to be awarded. And by so doing, it was a success. You move on, you also talk about newspapers. They were not going to be censored. Newspapers, they were censored. They only talked about the goodness of Louis, nobility, Mary Antoinette, Louis. But now here, it was now different. Why? It is because newspapers, they were now free to publish anything that was taking place in the country. The news that were worth recording, the news that were worth to be given to the people, they were now given to the people. That is what the people wanted. So the 1791 Constitution, it satisfied the demands of the French revolutionaries. You also move on. You also talk about the issue of religious toleration. People were now free to go to any church that they wanted. People were now free to attend a service of any church that they wanted. That is what the people wanted. That is what the people expected. Number two, the priests now were going to be paid by the state. You remember the priest lived a miserable life, but now here things were now different. The priests were now paid by the state. That is what the people expected. You move on, you talk also about the issue of education. It was put under the control of the church. That is what the people wanted. That is what the people expected. This was a success to a greater extent. You move on, you also talk about another issue. This issue was about the issue of what? Of the people now participating, being given the land, the church lands, they were taken, they were given to the people. This is what the people wanted. Why? They were facing problems of poverty. Lumo was not there. Hunger, starvation. Why hunger? Why starvation? It is because they did not have enough land. But now here they were now having enough land, and by so doing now, they were now going to utilize that land. Problems of poverty, problems of food shortages were going to be a thing of the past, and by so doing now, it was a success to a greater extent. Then you move on, you also talk about another success in this constitution. The success was that now we see that there were now rights. People were now having rights. During the time of Louis, people did not have rights, but now here we've got rights. People were now having rights to vote. People were now having rights to say anything that they wanted to say. People were now having rights to be tried by jury. You said, I did this and that. You should go to the courts of laws. Then the courts of laws would determine whether we're supposed to be arrested or not. That is what the people wanted. Rights were decreed, rights were deliberated. So by so doing, this 1791 constitution, it fulfilled the demands of the French revolutionaries. Then we also see that political clubs were formed, the Jacobins, which consisted of those people who were extreme, who were known as the extremists or the leftist. You talk about the Girondist, another party that was formed. You talk about the Cordillans, another party that was formed. You talk about the Center Party, another party that was formed. You talk about the Felons, another party that was formed. During the time of Louis, no one was supposed to oppose Louis. No one was supposed to say anything against Louis. But here now, we now have political clubs. We've got now political parties that were now free to express themselves, that were now free to participate in an election, that were now free to recruit members, that were now free to hold parties or to hold rallies or to meet and deliberate on anything that they wanted. That was a milestone. That was an achievement. So by so doing, this 1791 constitution, it satisfied the demands of the French people. That is what the people expected, and it was a success to a greater extent. But however, on the other side of the question, we are saying that to a lesser extent, the 1791 constitution, it satisfied the demands of the French revolutionaries to a lesser extent. Why do we say so? Very few people participated in the elections of 1791. There were very few people. They could not meet the requirements. Those people who voted, they were known as active citizens. These active citizens, they were supposed to pay an expected amount of taxes. So many people in France, they were poor. So many people in France were needy. They could not meet the requirements that were expected for them to vote. So because of that now, very few people voted. So to a lesser extent, it did not satisfy. To a lesser extent, it satisfied the demands of the French revolutionaries to a lesser extent. Then we also see that it satisfied the demands of the French people. Why? It is because they abolished tithe. That on its own did not go well to others. So because of that, now we see some priests moving away, and they were now known as the non-jury priests. You move on, you also talk about the revolutionaries choosing members of the clergy. They overreacted. So that on its own, it was a success to a lesser extent. Then we also see that they had to say that the Pope in Rome was not supposed to have a say over priests in France. That on its own, it was an overreaction. So that we can say that it satisfied the demands of the French revolutionaries to a lesser extent. But generally, overally, what can we say? We are saying that the 1791 Constitution, it satisfied the demands of the French revolutionaries. It touched so many aspects. It addressed so many aspects. It had to look on so many aspects that the people expected to be done. Remember, when they revolted, they wanted so many aspects to be considered. And these aspects, they were considered. They were put into cognizance. They were put into consideration. By so doing, that is why we are saying that this 1791 Constitution, it fulfilled the ideals of the French revolutionaries. Although to a lesser extent, there were some aspects that we say that they overreacted. By so doing, fulfilling the aspirations, fulfilling the aspects of the French revolutionaries to a lesser extent. That is what we have. Let me repeat my question again. To what extent did the 1791 Constitution satisfy the demands of the revolutionaries in France? Thank you so much. I'm Mr. Muso.